Hello and welcome to the Gaggle What We Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I want to just record a very short video on the very strange apocalyptic events that took place this week when there was a massive internet failure, which led to all sorts of crises at airports, hospitals, and everywhere. And the source of the problem was CrowdStrike, which is a cybersecurity firm, and apparently it had faulty update software, which is incompatible with Windows, and that's why it just shut everything down. Now, clearly, this was a total failure on the part of CrowdStrike. I mean, CrowdStrike introduced this software update. Now, those of us, who are of an older generation will remember CrowdStrike from the great days of Russiagate. Now, CrowdStrike is now a massive company, worth billions in assets. It's valued in the billions. It's now on NASDAQ, and it's used by the biggest companies in the world. It's there supposedly to provide cybersecurity, to fight off hacks. Didn't do a very good job in this case, but of course, it didn't do a very good job in Russiagate. It's the same firm. It wasn't such a big deal back then. And the reason why CrowdStrike is now this huge conglomerate is what it did in Russiagate. So if you recall, back in 2016, CrowdStrike had made a claim that the DNC server had been hacked by Russia. What was striking about the claim is that this was an entirely based on CrowdStrike's own investigations. So there was no FBI involvement in all of this. It was just the DNC hired CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike came along and made this claim that it was the Russians had hacked the DNC server. And even more interesting was that the FBI, according to James Comey, had accepted CrowdStrike's claim without doing its own investigation. No investigation at all. It just simply accepted what CrowdStrike said without bothering to do anything. And in fact, FBI notably never even asked CrowdStrike to provide its data so that FBI could actually verify CrowdStrike's claims. It's like, imagine if there were a bank robbery and the bank tells the police, well, we know who the bank robber is from our own security cameras. And then, the police don't even bother to say, well, can we take a look at the footage? No, we'll keep the footage. But the bank robber is Jim and Bob. We know because, it's on our footage. But that's the way it was here with the FBI. Very, very strange, because after all, a hack is a crime. And if it's a crime, then the FBI is obligated to investigate it. Now, the story of the Russian hack worked very well. It worked very well for the Obama administration to somehow suggest that Trump was working with the Russians, but it worked for Hillary Clinton, because let's remember, Hillary Clinton had been beset from 2015 onwards by this issue of her own homebrew server. And because it was obvious that the homebrew server had been hacked, I mean, why wouldn't it be? I mean, it would be the easiest thing in the world to hack her own personal server. Hillary Clinton was obviously expecting somebody, Russia maybe, would disclose the contents of her emails and her messages, which almost certainly pertain to her get-rich-quick schemes, how she was trying to use her position as Secretary of State to fill the coffers of the Clinton Foundation and no doubt fill her own coffers. And obviously, Hillary Clinton was expecting at some point in 2016 for this information to be disclosed. And what better way to anticipate this disclosure than to say, oh, you know, the Russians have hacked our servers. The Russians are trying to help Putin. Russians are trying to help Trump defeat Hillary Clinton because the Russians are terrified of what Hillary Clinton might do. So the CrowdStrike story that the Russians had hacked the DNC served a number of purposes. And of course, if you recall, the Obama administration was actively putting out the story of the Russian interference in the election, and therefore the claims of CrowdStrike were instrumental in all of this. But as it turned out, and this was of course hidden from view, because let's remember, CrowdStrike's claims were accepted by Mueller. Mueller, who, you know, in his report had unambiguously declared that the DNC server had been hacked by the GRU and that the GRU had passed on the information to WikiLeaks. That was Mueller's claim. So Mueller accepted, without question, just as the FBI did, the claims of CrowdStrike. And this is what's given CrowdStrike this reputation, which allowed it to become this massive multi-billion-dollar global corporation, even though it's clear that it has a complete incompetence as its trademark. But let's take a look at what happened when CrowdStrike was forced to testify before the House Intelligence Committee. So when the hearings before the House Intelligence Committee in 2017 were kept hidden, absolutely kept was a secrecy. So this was a clever maneuver of the Russiagate hoaxers, that they kept all this secret and really didn't come out till 2020 what it is that people had actually said before the House Intelligence Committee when they were under oath. In other words, it's not just, you know, shooting your mouth off when you're on Morning Joe. You're now under oath, and therefore you have to tell the truth. Otherwise, you face prosecution for perjury. So CrowdStrike, in the person of its head of security, Sean Henry, was forced to testify before the House Intelligence. And of course, they wanted to know how CrowdStrike could be so certain that it was the Russians who had hacked the DNC. So let's take a look at what happened during this testimony. So here we have Congressman Stewart from Utah, and he says, and would you just conclude with what you discovered and how you discovered it and what you did with the information? So what happened, as I said, that CrowdStrike was hired by the DNC, but it wasn't directly by the DNC, it was through Perkins Coie. And the person at Perkins Coie who hired CrowdStrike was none other than Michael Sussman. Michael Sussman, you recall, was the one who approached the FBI to tell them that apparently there was this a server in Trump Tower that was communicating with Alpha Bank in Moscow. It was all total nonsense. And because supposedly Sussman did not reveal to the FBI when he approached them that he was actually acting as a surrogate for the Clinton campaign, Durham indicted Sussman, but of course in DC it was all immediately it was a jury of course acquitted him of all charges. But you can see how Russiagate was orchestrated by a very small group of people. And Sussman was there on this server, connected to Alpha Bank in Moscow. So he's instrumental in that, and he's also instrumental in this in launching this investigation of the DNC hack. Sussman, who's an attorney at Perkins Coie, approaches CrowdStrike and say, "Well, why don't you investigate and find out who's behind this?" As if they're in any doubts. They knew exactly what CrowdStrike would find. So Henry says, yeah, so we did some forensic analysis in the environment. We deployed technology into the environment, into the network software called Falcon, that essentially looked at the processes that are running on different computers in the environment. We also looked historically at the environment using different pieces of software and so on. And we saw activity that we believed was consistent with activity we'd seen previously and had associated with the Russian government. Notice his weaselly words. We saw activity that we believed was consistent with activity that we'd seen previously and had associated with the Russian government. And then Stewart goes on, and can you identify that as being with a fair degree of confidence that it's associated with the Russian government? And then Henry replies, we said that we had a high degree of confidence it was the Russian government, and our analysts that looked at it, that had looked at these types of attacks before, many different types of attacks similar to this in different environments, certain tools that were used, certain methods by which they were moving in the environment, and looking at the types of data that was being targeted, that it was consistent with a nation-state adversary and associated with Russian intelligence. A lot of verbiage there, essentially masking that he has no real evidence, that it was consistent with a nation-state adversary and associated with Russian intelligence. Associated. What does that mean? Either it is or it isn't. So then Henry says, there are other nation states that collect this type of intelligence for sure, but what we could call tactics and techniques were consistent with what we'd seen associated with the Russian state. Now, of course, again, it was always very curious, why would the Russian government, or indeed Chinese government, or Iranian government, or any government, all the bad guys, the rogue governments, why would they want to hack the DNC? I mean, what's there that would be very interested for them? I mean, they might want to hack into the Clinton Foundation. They might want to hack into Clinton State Department server, the homebrew server that she kept in her bathroom. But what's in the DNC? I mean, why would that? That's why none of this ever was plausible, because the whole issue of, oh, this was very unflattering about how the DNC had robbed Bernie Sanders. Why would the Russians be, or Chinese or anyone else be interested in that? I mean, what do they care whether it's Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders? Anyway, then Stewart goes on. And so because I'm not familiar with this, I'm trying to give it a little more context. You said high confidence or high degree of confidence. We use that phrase in the IC, that's intelligence community, as you know, and it means you know something, but it's not, absolute in its meaning. And so an analogy might be a fingerprint. If you have a fingerprint and I know that the fingerprints are match, and I understand that kind of because of my life and just being alive and knowing, that's fairly accurate, a high degree of confidence. Is that the same level of confidence as a fingerprint, or is it something less than that in your ability to define it as the Russian government? And then Henry starts shifting around. Well, there wasn't a videotape of the Russians with their fingers on the keyboard, but the activities were consistent with what we'd seen previously, targeting the State Department, for example, the Joint Chiefs and other governments, Western governments, and it was consistent with what we'd seen previously and associated with the Russian government. But again, consistent. How do you have any proof that all the other cases you actually got it right, that it was the Russian government? You say, well, it's consistent, consistent with all the other times when we'd accused the Russian government of being behind some hack or other. And then Stewart goes on. He's obviously very unsatisfied with these responses. And in those other instances you mentioned, was there any subsequent evidence that verified it really was the Russian government that maybe wasn't found in this case? Exactly, that's the important point to make. In other words, you can make your initial analysis, we think this is the Russian government, then as time plays out, you have other evidence that proves, yeah, it was the Russian government. I'm sure that's been the case in some cases, right? I think that when you're looking at attribution, it's you look at an aggregate across many different attacks over a long period of time, years in many cases, and the intelligence that you collect leads you to a certain conclusion, and I think that's the case here. So we just looked around and we basically cherry-picked whatever we wanted. We just cherry-picked the evidence because we already made the conclusion the Russian government was behind it, and so we just looked around and whatever seemed to confirm that it was the Russian government, we just say, yeah, that's proof that it was the Russian government. And then Stewart goes on, at any point, are you aware of the FBI ever asking for access to anything, whether it's coding or whether it's something you're collected or whether it's the DNC and their equipment or hardware? Did the FBI ever, as far as you know, ask for access, and were they informed by the client they could not have that access? Again, because Stewart, right, is wondering where's the FBI in all of this? Isn't this a criminal matter? Like, shouldn't they be investigating a hack? And then Henry says, I'm not aware of the FBI asking the DNC for data. And this was subsequently confirmed by Comey in his testimony. He never bothered. He just to ask for to see the DNC server, the DNC server to be investigated by the FBI. But what's interesting is that the FBI didn't even ask for the CrowdStrike's analysis. In other words, they didn't even ask for, well, let's at least see the actual analysis that the CrowdStrike presented. Let's see all of the data and so on. So they never looked for anything. I mean, they just accepted CrowdStrike's claims. And then now Adam Schiff jumps in, doubtless in order to help out Henry. And Schiff says, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Castro. And then he says, my colleague asked you whether the damage that was done to the DNC through the hack might have been mitigated had the DNC employed your services earlier. Do you know the date in which the Russians exfiltrated the data from the DNC? So here he says something very specific. He says, do you know the date in which the Russians exfiltrated the data from the DNC? Because remember, that's the claim. That's the claim that was made by CrowdStrike, repeated ad nauseum in the media, repeated ad nauseum by Mueller and everyone else. The Russians had the hack and extracted all the data through a hack. Now, as we know, the intelligence experts at the VIPS, people like Ray McGovern and the rest, said that this cannot be done, that there was no way that you can extract such a massive amount of data via a hack. That's why they thought that it had to have been somebody with a thumb drive. That's the only way you can get it. You can't extract so much data via a hack. And then, but here Schiff says, do you know the date in which the Russians exfiltrated the data from the DNC? So here Schiff is already accepting it was the Russians, even though Congressman Stewart had just sort of, forced the admission from Henry that, well, we just kind of assumed it was the Russians based on everything else we know about the Russians, but you don't have any specific proof that it was the Russian. And then he says, well, Russians exfiltrated the data. And then Henry says, I have to just think about it. I do know. I mean, it's in our report that I think the committee has. And then Schiff says, okay, and to the best of your recollection, when would that have been? And then Henry, who's obviously been reminded by counsel kind of whispered something in his ear. And then Henry says, counsel just reminded me that as it relates to the DNC, we have indicators that data was exfiltrated. We do not have concrete evidence that data was exfiltrated from the DNC, but we have indicators that it was exfiltrated. So remember what he's saying here. We have indicators. We don't have any evidence that this information was exfiltrated from the DNC. Now, leave aside the whole issue of the Russians. We don't have any evidence that this data was exfiltrated via a hack. So all of the claims of Comey and Mueller, and of course the media, oh yeah, it was a hack, and the GRU hacked it and extracted all the data. He just says, no, we don't have any evidence. We have indicators, whatever indicators means. And counsel had told him that, hey, you say that it was exfiltrated by the Russians. You could get yourself into some legal difficulties now. So you better come back and say, well, we have indicators that it was exfiltrated. We don't actually have evidence that it was exfiltrated. Then Schiff goes on, and the indicators that it was exfiltrated, when does it indicate that would have taken place? Again, it's in the report. I believe it was April 2016. I'm confused on the date. I think it was April, but it's in the report. Itself is very strange. I mean, this is your big issue. You've been dining out on this this hack of the DNC and how you had identified that it was the Russians who were behind it, and now you seem very vague about the date as to when this hack was supposed to have taken place. And then Schiff goes, it provides in the report 2016, April the 22nd, date stage for the exfiltration by the fancy bear actor. Again, Schiff says this exfiltration, even though Sean Henry, the guy who was head of security at CrowdStrike, is really saying, I don't have any evidence of this exfiltration. And Mr. Henry, yes, sir. So that again, stage for which I mean, there's not the analogy I used for Mr. Stewart earlier was we don't have the video of it happening, but there are indicators that it happened. There are times when we can see data exfiltrated and we can say conclusively, but in this case, it appears it was set up to be exfiltrated, but we just don't have the evidence that says it actually left. So they don't have anything. And even though this was repeated over and over and over again, that about the hack got all this information out from the DNC. They passed it on to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and it was all engineered by the Russians. So clearly, Henry says, we don't know it was the Russians. We kind of made that assumption, and we don't actually even know that it was the information was exfiltrated. This was, of course, kept hidden. He testified in 2017, and we didn't get these transcripts published until 2020, long after Mueller had published his report. Now, listen, but Mueller had seen the transcripts. You couldn't keep, these were kept secret from the public. They was not kept secret from Mueller. So Mueller knew that there was never any basis for the claim of the exfiltration, or the claim that the Russians were behind this. And therefore, there was no evidence for the claim that the Russians stole the data and passed it on to WikiLeaks in order to help Trump. All of this whole story was just cooked up as part of the FBI, Mueller, Comey, the Democrats, the Clinton campaign, and of course, CrowdStrike. And so CrowdStrike went on to success after this fraud, and now the world is paying the price for allowing this fraud to be perpetrated. CrowdStrike is obviously an absolutely crappy, useless company. It always was. It's based on a fraud. It's based on a bogus reputation. And now we had this almighty crash that, affected media, affected communications, affected plane flights, affected hospitals, everything was affected thanks to CrowdStrike. This was where CrowdStrike made its reputation, and companies bought into it, and sought out its services because it's supposedly so good on cybersecurity. Of course, it was always useless on cybersecurity because it was always a deceitful organization, and eagerly and willingly played the role assigned to it by Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, and of course the FBI. Anyway, that was my short video. I hope you enjoyed it, and remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.